JSurge is an organization that is dedicated to bringing Judaism to Jews. And we do it in many different ways. We do it through writing, we do it through editorializing, we do it through programs of tikkun olam, of fixing the world and social justice. We do it by bringing fee-for-service services for anyone who's interested in Judaism in all its forms. And we are happy tonight to host this discussion. With me is Avi West. Avi has recently retired after 45 years as the senior educator and officer and master teacher of the Federation of Greater Washington. And I've known Avi for most of that time, and I can tell you that he is Jewish education in Washington, and he knows Jewish education more than just about anyone else, except me, of course, but anyone else that I've ever met. So we are going to begin soon. I just wanted to remind everyone that JSurge has its own website, jsurge.org, JSURGE.org, and its sister website, JMorim, JMORIM.org, which is specifically for Jewish educators. And one more introduction is, for those of you who know me, you know that I have a cat named Jerry, and Jerry is sitting behind me right now, but Jerry is an interesting cat in that he likes to play fetch, and he hates Zoom. So at some point you may hear some growling in the background, which is my cat, and he will be bringing a plush toy, a stuffed animal, which looks like him, and in order to quiet him, I will have to throw it down the stairs and he will run after it. I do not apologize for this because we do not apologize for our pets at times of the pandemic. Last March, in the Jewish community, we were watching and observing forces that were affecting us. For instance, brick and mortar congregations were at risk. Membership was dwindling, denominations were shrinking. And this, we felt, was a natural result of the dynamics that have been building up for decades. And then the pandemic hit. And while we can't see the end of the pandemic yet, we are firmly ensconced in the middle. But we've been in this situation for so long that we've been watching, we've been observing the Jewish community. And there are some questions that we're asking now, questions of where are we as a Jewish community? What are we as Jews? And can we see the possibilities of what we will be at the end when we can put this pandemic behind us? Have we changed? And have we changed because of the pandemic or in spite of the pandemic? Now, there's been a lot of traffic in the Jewish community about some of these issues, but I think that tonight we're going to bring a very different view, and more importantly, we're going to try to at least unmask a different facet to this question. So I'd like to begin by handing it off to Avi for his observations. One other thing, I apologize. If you have a question, put it in, there are two ways to do it. One, at the bottom of your screen, you have reactions. It's on the bottom right of my screen. As you can see, I like what I'm saying, so I put the thumbs up. And if I want to be recognized, I put my hands up. But if you do have a question, also you can either do it with your hands or you can put it into the chat room. You can chat and you can say, I have a question. Then we will be stopping several times during this talk for questions, and we will either unmute you or you can put the question into the chat. Thank you. And Avi, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Steve. And I thank JSurge for inviting me to be with you tonight. It is great to see everybody. We are so used to the Brady Bunch being our new family with all the matrices and faces. So I will add what I can in terms of my observations up front, and then we can go at it and do some deeper analysis. So this past Saturday night, my wife and I walked around our modern Orthodox neighborhood, and we dropped by a number of tents tents that were put up in the courtyards of synagogues and some other homes where people had gathered to celebrate the Simchat Torah with masks and with social distancing intact. A steady stream of people of all ages drift in and out of this rejoicing with the Torah, and I found myself singing Am Yisrael Chai. People Israel are a living entity, living, morphing, growing, changing. Like the old Timex watch commercial, we take a licking but keep on sticking. We have a way to respond and do things which keep us going. Whether motivated by Jewish law or human need, creative and nimble strategies to celebrate, to give thanks, pray and praise, and otherwise stay connected to community were on display all over. And they are a critical, vital sign for future Jewish life. We're now 8 months into the pandemic, a time period that includes all the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, as well as other fast and feast days and the high holidays. That is enough to create a chazakah, a Jewish term for the presumption of ownership due to a repeated pattern. The repeated pattern means that you own something. Could be in actually taking something in your hand, the use of something, but that's a chazakah. The naturally slow evolutions in Jewish practice have been ratcheted up to warp speed during this crisis. Changes that people talked about for a long time but just hadn't come to be are now taking place in shuls, schools, community institutions, and in people's homes. All the leaders and experts calling for change could not do what this pandemic has done to make the case for doing things differently and at an accelerated pace. I don't want to minimize the health, economic, and social harm caused by COVID-19. They are great, and it is a somber time when we assess that. But the global reaction by Jews to the pandemic conditions moved Judaism from seemingly being something known to be a compulsory set of things, Jewish law, or mitzvah, whatever, to something that is actually even more compelling. I, like so many others, were able to zoom around the globe and experience services across denominational and ethnic, Sephardic, Ashkenazic, Edot HaMizrach, as well as geographic borders. After my father passed away in April, the burial was only attended by myself, my wife, our daughter. But our son, who lives in Israel, cousins from all over the world, joined in by Zoom and on FaceTime. And I found the Shiva less awkward and even more interactive than I expected. And therefore, it fulfilled its task as a comfort and a fitting memorial, at least in my case. I realized that things do not have to be measured in binary form, better or worse. They could just be different. And then we need to have patience and distance to evaluate how things went. I also watched with pride as Jewish institutions first scrambled to continue providing content to their membership. I watched Hebrew schools and day schools and synagogues, adult learning programs, all moved to the Zoom. Zoom gali gali, we got on the wave. And after a while, we saw that people were zoomed out. People wanted less content and more community. And so we finally listened to those who for years have been cautioning us to merge high tech with high touch. Synagogues stepped up to function as food pantries and counseling centers. And we found ways to fix that wobbly three-legged stool of Jewish life that seemed to overly connect synagogue with a prayer service. And we stabilized it. We stabilized the footing of all of that Jewish life through Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim. We balanced our community agenda with study and prayer and all sorts of activities of loving kindness, including all the recognition of graduates and the parades and all of that that felt like building community. So back to the concept of chazakah, I believe that the patterns that were established over these 8 months have established a legitimate claim of ownership over Jewish life. As Dr. Ron Wolfson from the American Jewish University wrote, after observing and interviewing clergy all over the States, the pandemic has forever shifted the way synagogues reach their congregants and beyond their sanctuaries to a worldwide audience. There is no going back, only forward. And we can explore that. See?
Thanks, Avi. Again, I'd like to remind everyone, if you have a question, put it in the chat room that you have a question so that we can recognize you. I find myself thinking of jokes on a regular basis and wondering how these jokes so adequately sum up our Jewish experience. And the joke that has hit me over the past month or so has been, there's a drought and it's affecting everyone. So the pastor gets up on a Sunday morning and he says, if everyone really, really, really prays this week, then we will have rain after services next Sunday. So everyone prays and prays and prays, and it comes next Sunday, and the pastor gets up there and he castigates the congregation and he says, you have no faith. And everyone says, but of course we prayed all week for rain. And the pastor says, then where are your umbrellas? And I find that one of the things that buoys me at this time is the recognition that we have a covenant with God. And that if you truly believe in that covenant, then the Jewish people are not at stake. We're not threatened with extinction. We've been through much, 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 much worse. And that this is a blip, which we will look back on and say, oh, look, if Judaism has changed. But ultimately, what I'm finding with people is a faith that things will be fine. And the changes that Avi has suggested in the community only support this assertion. I did not go to services on Rosh Hashanah. I slept in Hebrew. The phrase is, I went to Sharei Shena, which is great gates of sleep. I just wasn't going to be inside, and there were no services outside, and I wasn't going to Zoom. And I found myself in a very spiritual place on Rosh Hashanah. And then for Kol Nidre, I Zoomed Kol Nidre because I wanted to hear the Kol Nidre. And I was with 2 other people, and we stood together listening to the Kol Nidre, and I was taken by how it affected me and how it affected them. It wasn't the same as being there, but it was different. It was, as Avi said, it wasn't better or worse. It was just a different experience. It was an experience that was meant for me. And I had the power of that experience. I wasn't sitting next to people who were talking about the rabbi's sermon, or I wasn't sitting next to people who hadn't seen each other all year and were high holiday friends. And the new dynamic in the community reminds me, I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and nothing ever happens Jewishly in Charlottesville, Virginia when you're growing up. But Chabad, the Lubavitch, came to Richmond, which was only 60 miles away. Now, the Richmond community at that time, you know, it was just after the Civil War, and the Richmond community at that time, the Spanish Civil War, the Jewish community at that time was very staid and very proud of itself, but there wasn't going to be an original thought that you were going to find, much less an original program. And when Chabad came, everyone got scared. And all of a sudden, there were programs in Richmond that you couldn't even count them because everyone was afraid, because now there was competition, and now there is competition. There is competition because, as Avi said, you can go anywhere. I have a friend who went to 4 Kol Nidre services, 1 Eastern Daylight Time, 1 Central, 1 Pacific, you name it, that person was there. And he just wanted to experience 4 different Kol Nidres. What has happened is the Zooming of our services and our programs has given the individual the power to decide what Judaism they want. And more importantly, it has given the individual the ability to choose. And that is going to change, in my opinion, the Jewish community, because as the song goes, how are you going to get them back on the farm after they've seen Paris? We all know that being a member of a congregation is really a voluntary thing, that people don't have to belong to any one congregation, but now membership itself is going to be voluntary. And in order for congregations to survive, they're going to have to cater to the individuals in the community. I believe we're moving to a non-clergy-led dynamic where the clergy are going to have to respond as opposed to not. So I see that we have no questions yet. I'm going to hand it back to Avi.
So I want to make a comment about the word covenant, because on one hand, this concept in Judaism of the covenant between God and the nation, actually between God and humanity, is that humanity will survive. And every time there's a storm and I look at the rainbow, I say the blessing of God, remember the covenant, right? No more wiping out of humanity. And we believe that through the stories in Deuteronomy, no matter what happens, what diasporas, what's going to challenge us, we will come home, whatever that is. We're going to come home at one point. But I see the covenant as an individual thing as well, which goes to the point, Steve, that you're making about the new realities between individuals, communities, clergy, leadership. And that is the covenant that says it's a two-way understanding. The way God said it in, let's say, the Shema, you follow my commandments, I give you rain, right? You sustain me through your righteous acts in the world, I sustain you. Fine. But what about between human beings? What about society? And where I see that is the new responsibility, while we are less in need of a non-clergy dynamic. Yeah, let's do that. What we are doing as individuals in picking, choosing, dropping in and out of a synagogue, questioning whether we pay dues, is that we're saying, I am going to have some ownership over my path. But the idea of covenant means that I have to take responsibility. I have to learn, I have to experiment, I have to experience, I have to think about it in a way that in fact can be passed along to family, to the next generation. That's a lot of work. Are we sure that that's going to happen? That I don't know. In various times, the slinky of Jewish life expands and contracts to a large number, a small compact group. So I think the idea of covenant that's intriguing to me is the DIY, the do-it-yourself DIY Judaism that people are starting to pick up on. And the way institutional Judaism has sort of coddled people now has to merge somehow. And there have to be new skills given for people to own their journey, their Jewish journey, and people have to step up to experiment and not simply be fed based on a sermon or somebody praying at them. And I see the pandemic and Zoom minyanim as tools for experimentation that can help that along.
I would, first of all, let me try to explain what a non-clergy dynamic is. Why do people belong to a congregation? People belong to a congregation. When I was growing up, you belonged to a congregation because that's what you had to do. That's what your parents did. That's what you do. As I became a rabbi, people came to a congregation many times because they wanted life cycle events, or they wanted someone who knew them. Every time I came into a new congregation, or every time, very often when members joined the congregation, they would come in and see me, and they would say to me, I've been sick, I don't know, but I joined this congregation because if God forbid I should die, I want someone officiating who actually knows who I am. And I want to tell you about myself. And that happened more often than I can count. So people would join for lots of different reasons, but each reason was to belong to that community. And so if you wanted to be a part of that community, the community was usually open to you. But what's happened now, and this is a dynamic that we believe was building even well before the pandemic, is that when the Jewish community began changing the dynamic, and this was all brought out by the Pew study that came out, 10 years ago, that the Jewish community, the denominations were shrinking, the brick and mortar congregations were shrinking. In no way are they ever going to disappear, because they are a vital part of our community. But they were shrinking, and people were not joining them, and yet Judaism was still important to these people. So now the established Jewish organizations, and by that I include all the organizations, the JCC, the day schools, even Jewish Family Service, have to plan to be able to provide services for people who do not necessarily need to be there. As Avi said, the covenant can be now an individual covenant. How do I want to be Jewish? Now, if I want to be Jewish in an easy way, I can join a congregation, I can have my child bar bat mitzvah, and I can do all of this, and it's provided for me. But now, if it doesn't fulfill the need of the individual, that person can go somewhere else. In several years ago, before I retired from my congregation, we wanted to have the religious school open to Zooming, or what we considered Zooming then. We wanted people who couldn't bring their children to school, we wanted them to be able to come into class. And the pushback we got was, we don't want to do that because we force our kids to come sometimes, and we don't want people not to have to force their kids to come. If my kids find out that someone is just coming from and staying in the living room, well, how am I going to get my kids to school? Well, now we have everyone on Zoom, and that will continue. There will be congregations in every municipality, in every community, who will continue to open their doors to Zooming. And I believe the congregations that don't are going to have a much harder time sustaining themselves, which means that the clergy are not leading the community as much as the community is making its decisions, and the clergy now are reacting to them. That's what I mean by a non-clergy dynamic. You don't need a rabbi or a cantor in order to be a part of the Jewish community and to enjoy the Jewish community. Avi.
Right. So obviously, Dem's fighting words in certain circles, and Dem's liberating words in other circles. And we're going to see how this plays out. And I think that as we were concluding that Judaism is alive, well, and safe for a future, the institutions of the Jewish community are not so safe. There are going to be issues. And in the short term, there will be people who are going to give up on membership because they haven't used everything. And that includes synagogues, JCCs, all sorts of other places of donation that other generations worked to support. And that includes the State of Israel. I'm going to be an a la carte Jew. I will participate and pay for those things that I use and that I find meaningful. And so it becomes a market strategy now, how to find ways to be relevant and make meaning for people, and have that become motivating in their whole life, their entire life, not just their Jewish life. And one of the things is the role of ritual. If ritual is a set choreography that doesn't change, and you go to shul and this is what you do, or you only do this at this and this time, and we don't help all of our community folks understand that everybody needs ritual. The human being needs ritual. I talked about chazakah as a pattern. We need patterns. We need distinctiveness, between hours and days of the week, between this activity and that activity. That's what brings meaning, and a ritual that highlights a distinction, the ritual of saying this day is Shabbat and here's how we make it different. The ritual of leaving, right, of Havdalah, of leaving Shabbat. These are broad metaphors that can be applied to so many other things. So that instead of the Groundhog Day approach, where during this pandemic, one day just moves into the next, Jewish consciousness says, let's find a ritual which makes things distinguishable, which makes things stand out. That is a Jewish approach to time, to activity, to behavior, and in the end, making meaning. When people get that concept, then I think new rituals and new environments for rituals are going to be created with meaning.
Let me concretize that. 2 weeks ago, I was working with a family that had suffered a tragic loss. An adult child had been murdered. And the medical examiner had the body because they were required to do an autopsy. And finally, the medical examiner released the body and we did the funeral. Now, the family was not involved at all and with any congregation, but they wanted to go to a Shiva minyan. What do? Well, it's easy. You contact a congregation that has an evening minyan and Zooms, and all of a sudden, this family that lives in Texas is going to a congregation in New Jersey for a Shiva minyan. One of the things that makes this so exciting, this time period so exciting, is simply the delicious ambivalence of Jewish law and the flexibility that Jewish law must have in liberal circles. And even in modern Orthodox circles, we're seeing that there's inherent flexibility in the tradition as the tradition itself tries to be sensitive to the needs. So someone who's in California, a wedding that I did, the bride and groom were in California. The witnesses were in Maryland. The bride's parents were in Chicago. The groom's parents were in DC, and I was in New Jersey. And we did it in such a way that even from a traditional point of view, the wedding was acceptable. There's flexibility there. And what we're seeing, as Avi, I think, implied earlier, is that individuals can now, I like the phrase a la carte Judaism, they can pick what they need. Now, I think what's going to happen is that once the pandemic is over, there'll be a natural snap back or an attempt to snap back to where we were before. But again, halachically, according to Jewish law, all of this has been opened up. It's going to be very hard to put the genie back in the bottle. And in truth, I'm not sure anyone really wants it. And again, as Avi said, in the short term, this is going to mean loss of jobs. I wouldn't want to be a pulpit rabbi right now because this is scary. I wouldn't want to be a synagogue leader right now because this is a very scary time in the immediate future. But the potential that is before us is so great that while Judaism itself is not in any way threatened, we will grow in certain ways, and will grow in ways that will eventually, I think, bear fruit. Now, there are stories, if everyone's familiar with the concept, with the houses or the yeshivot or the studies of Hillel and Shammai. 2,000 years ago, Hillel and Shammai were leaders of the Jewish community, and everyone, I think, knows the story of Hillel and Shammai. Someone who wants to convert comes to Shammai and says, I'll convert to Judaism if you teach me everything while I'm standing on one foot. And Shammai kicks him out of his area, and he goes to Hillel and says the same thing. And Hillel's response is, what is hateful to you, do not do to others. It's the negative golden rule. Go and learn. Now, we all love Hillel because it's a great answer. Hillel happens to be wrong. You're telling me that we would convert someone if we teach them the whole Torah while standing on one foot? The absolute chutzpah of that request makes it almost invalid. Shammai halachically is right, but we love Hillel. And what people do not recognize or remember about Hillel and Shammai is that they lived at the same time, and they also lived a time of great Roman persecution. Their goal was to keep the Jewish community together. Shammai's way of keeping the Jewish community together was to make it homogeneous and to circle the wagons and not let anyone in. Hillel's way of keeping it together was to open every window and door and just be as expansive and opening to everyone. Now, the Talmud tells us in teaching about the differences between Hillel and Shammai that no matter how the arguments went, they were still able to marry each other. In other words, the descendants of Hillel, or the followers of Hillel and the followers of Shammai, got along to the point that they were in the same community. And we're going to find that Judaism is more expansive, that Judaism is spreading out. One last point, that when the Pew Study first came out, I was amazed that every denomination came forward and said, you know, the Pew Study is right. The Pew Study is right. Judaism is changing and we're losing affiliation. But we as our movement, we have the answer. We know what to do. And what they didn't recognize is that the Pew Study itself was criticizing the individual denominations for exactly that type of attitude. And that the only way for the denominations to survive as they wanted to was to open their doors. Now, that may or may not be right, but I believe that we are, while the denominations will not disappear, what we have seen in the last decade is that they're shrinking and they're condensing. And that leaves a large part of the Jewish community in unaffiliated territory. What we will look back on this pandemic and recognize that Judaism is able to adapt and it's able to evolve in ways that we cannot necessarily foresee, but it will adapt. And seeing that there are still no questions, I hand it back to Avi.
This is becoming the French Open. But it's love, love. That's always going to be the score. Yeah, I think that...
I'm treating you like your feet are made of clay, by the way.
Well, why not? Clay Kodesh, of course.
Right.
The idea that the institutions are going to suffer is probably true, but there are ways around it if, like the Hillel and Shammai tale, we can get our community more unified and share. I mean, this isn't, it's different and similar to the exodus from the inner cities to the suburbs, and then moving around. There were times when synagogues had to consolidate, times when they expanded. We know now that there is an expansion of brick and mortar buildings versus, and Steve will like this, right? I just got this today. being without borders, right? The theory of relativity in Judaism is that the time-space continuum needs to be more flexible, and we have to share resources. We have to pool, especially now, good staff for more full-time, well-paid positions, doing more full-time work across different generations, and communicate between the families and the professionals, the early childhood, the middle school, the bar mitzvah programs, and on through adulthood. Only by doing that will we bring the right resources to bear and see our way through. A friend is Rabbi David Evan Marcus, New York Island, City Island Synagogue. He says that there's a new 3 R's for Judaism in the 21st century. You know, we talked about reading, writing, and arithmetic. Well, the 3 R's in Judaism for sustainability is resilience, resourcefulness, and respect, which is the great way to summarize that Hillel story. That's really what we need, and it's up to leadership to help lead us to that and guide us, but it's up to each individual to push the agenda and act in Hillel fashion.
We have some questions.
Yes.
So if we can unmute David.
Hey, everybody. I guess my question, it just dawned on me, or it struck me. Do you either of you think we'll see more non-Jewish people and kind of lost Jews come back to Judaism or enter Judaism or try to get involved in Judaism, being that they can attend a synagogue service now online or learn the prayers or like the rabbi without meeting them physically? So I think that's going to change also, because there's a lot of people looking for something more in their life. And I think Judaism, to some people, will give you that. And so it'll open that up where it's never been opened before. Maybe.
So my answer to that would be absolutely. We know from and also this will be part of, to answer for, at least for me, and then I'll hand it off to Avi, is that the question of a major role of the synagogue is community. How do we keep that if we no longer have brick and mortar? One of the greatest problems or challenges to a person who has not been part of the Jewish community or has never been part of the Jewish community is walking into the synagogue or walking into the temple. I have found over my experience that no matter how friendly you are, walking through those doors is one of the hardest things you can possibly do. And yes, I do think that the ability to Zoom onto services or to Zoom into a program where you may not know anyone, but then you don't have to put your picture, you don't have to have a live picture, that will be a welcoming sign. As far as the loss of community, as I said before, we're never going to lose brick and mortar congregations. They are too much a part of our tradition, and they're too important to our tradition as well. But that's the good news. The bad news is, and it's not necessarily bad, is that I would have to state, in my opinion, brick and mortar congregations, while they create community, also destroy it. Because anyone who's ever been a member of a congregation knows that if you're in the congregation, you're part of that community, and if you're not, you're not. And that within the congregation, their definition of community is usually them. And so anyone who's outside, who's not a member of the congregation, and if you want proof of that, just go to a board meeting and try to get the congregation, the board, to put their resources towards doing some type of outreach to a population like single parents or people who can't afford to pay dues. Now, most boards would actually end up doing that, but you'll get a lot of pushback because if you can't afford to pay, why are we trying to bring you in? So the community is going to change. It's going to morph. There still will be different communities. We've always had small communities. We get together for the big things, like bringing in the Ethiopian Jews, or working with the then Soviet Jews, or the major things that we unite for. But for the small things every day, we're not one community. We are many, many different communities. Avi?
So here's an anecdote that has been true over and over and over again. If you know about some of the stuff that happens, the magic of Jewish summer camp. So somebody was talking to a group of kids who came back from Camp Ramah, and I think one of the teachers were talking to them and said, you know, don't forget, after Shabbat, you should continue to do Havdalah. And the kid looks at the teacher and says, how can we? We don't have a lake. But the concept of that sacred place of camp where there was a lake and people were around it, and there was this ritual reenactment of fire and giving fire back through the Havdalah candle and the lake, it was just so impressive that to do it without that place, without those props, without that stuff that props you up, was almost unthinkable. That's one of the challenges. To take what synagogues are supposed to be, which is an exemplar of a brick and mortar temple, as an exemplar of a place of study and prayer and gathering and all that. And instead, like the story with Jacob, when Jacob was running from his brother Esau and starts leaving the boundary of Israel and of the land of Israel, and he goes to sleep and he's afraid of what's going to happen, and there's this dream and the ladder and God and angels, and he feels protected, and he wakes up, and what does he say? Oh, I did not know, right? God is in this place, and I did not know. What do you mean you didn't know? You didn't get that memo? God is everywhere. You have to let God in, or you have to wonder about how to make it happen. And the people who are making the comments say, the Hebrew is strange. Va'anochi lo yadati. I did not know. So they said, yeah, that means my ego, my surrounded self-centered stuff didn't let God in, didn't let me be open. When we can take the brick and mortar and say it's only a metaphor, it's an example, make your home a place for spirituality. Go out when you walk, go out in the woods, camp, do everything, find the moments of that spirit. Then you go to shul to share it, because that's what we do. We go to talk and over Kiddush, hey, did you? That will be even a healthier set of community experiences.
We have a question from Ava and Steve.
Hi. Do you think this Zoom type of Judaism will have a much more dramatic effect on Jewish education than younger kids? They're not in a building. They don't have the rapport with the rabbi. They don't have the games, the history. They're just getting it on Zoom.
Avi, you are the educator. Let me point it off to you first.
Yeah, well, thanks. I think that it's never either or, right? Everything is going to have to be a hybrid. Believe me, kids were not getting much education in their schools. They're just not. We know that. Let's face it. Let's be real. In fact, some of the best stuff that they were getting were the relationships with the other kids, the relationship with the teacher, and then some facts and ideas that were coming up. But the schools were already changing and saying, we need experiential programs. We need field trips. We need things that challenge the kids. And we need to affect the home, because without the home backing all this stuff up, they're not going to get anything. They're going to think, where's God? God is in the classroom. God is in the synagogue. So it's never either or. I think what Zoom is doing is, and I have this thing I want to talk about. One of my favorite teachers was Dr. Jonathan Wucher of blessed memory, New Jersey. And one of his last papers was design principles for the 21st century education. And he said the design principles are built around three concepts. One, empowering the learner as an active agent in fashioning his or her learning experience. Didn't happen in classrooms. It's starting to happen in the way Zoom's lessons are being constructed. Second, the centrality of relationships and social experience. It could be absent from Zoom, except that technology is now pushing teachers to use breakout rooms, to stop and think, to do experiences and to do, in fact, web searches and use videos and then ask questions. Jewish learning as life-centered, addressing the totality of our aspirations, concerns, experiences. Hanukkah isn't about dreidels and latkes. It's about, can we stand up and say no to things? Can we find light when it's really dark? How do we address that and get real? And then the learner as an active agent. I believe technology is actually going to push us to touch all of those features. And then when we come back together, we will have a more enriched system.
And you don't know how things are going to pan out in the immediate future. Jewish education, education in general, is not immediate gratification. And you just never know. I mean, I'm the perfect example of that. After my bar mitzvah, I turned around and blew a kiss to the shul and said, I'll never see you again. And look what happened to me. My brother was valedictorian of his yeshiva class, and now we've switched places. I'm now the professional Jew, and he doesn't know when Yom Kippur is. So you never know what's going to, but I do agree with Avi that the technology is giving us possibilities. And what's more important from my point of view is that it is forcing the leadership and the teachers, the educators, to learn the technology. I would like to come back to what Helene asked, which was, Dr. Lawrence Hoffman notes that during this pandemic legacy, institutions and synagogues have responded in one of three ways: double down or circle the wagons, adapt and reimagine. Do you think our organizations and leaders have the confidence to work together without fear of loss? And the answer, I think, is current leadership, no. I don't believe that current leadership is capable of it because they were brought up in a different system. This requires a lack of ego. Look, I live in a town called Millburn, New Jersey, and I actually live in Springfield, but I lived in Millburn, New Jersey, and the distance between Millburn and South Orange, where Jonathan Wucher lived, it took 15 minutes at most to get from Millburn to South Orange. But if you were going from South Orange to Millburn, it took a half an hour. We used to say that because we couldn't do programs together because everyone had an ego. And and I can't count the number of congregations, both Jewish and non-Jewish, that went down and went bankrupt rather than join together. We are not only, and I think Helene brings up an excellent point, which is that we are not only in transition, or I'll make the point based on this, but we're not only in transition for clergy, we're in transition for leadership as well. A new cadre of leadership has to come forward. And for the other question of from other faiths, what they've been doing, that is innovative, I can tell you that the Catholic Church had a real theological problem, because what are you going to do if you can't take communion? And for those of you who are aware, if you can't take communion, then you're in real theological trouble. And what most of the churches came up with, they suddenly came out and said, well, you know, communion is a metaphor. You can take a spiritual communion. Wow, I got to tell you, If I were Catholic, I'm not sure how I would deal with that. But all of a sudden, the ritual changed. And they will go back to communion, and they have gone back to communion, and they've created communion that actually comes to parishioners individually and with all the protections, and from the synagogue reaching out individually. My congregation in Milburn did something for the high holidays, which was absolutely fantastic. They sent a care package to every family for the high holidays. That showed individuals that the congregation was thinking of them. And this idea of expanding beyond your borders, going outside of exporting your gifts to the congregants as opposed to waiting for them to come in, is something that a lot of the denominations are beginning to do, and that is a very special thing. Avi?
I think that those other faiths and denominations that considered themselves houses of worship only, and required them to come in and have their minyan there, found themselves bereft, and their parishioners not sure what to do and why should they belong. And so there was a pivot in many places where the mission became tikkun olam. Wow, great idea. And we do have that in common with, and in fact, it is an important commonality in the American democracy, that finding something to repair, making yourself have antennae that sees the other and is on the lookout for doing something in world repair, being entrepreneurial in world repair, is a meta mitzvah, which doesn't take the place of all the other things, but when you're doing that, that's the real world. And then anything you do for study or prayer actually reinforces that. And the churches that I've seen around my neighborhood have been doing that. One local one is a food distribution center. Every Tuesday, it becomes a giant food pantry. And no one will forget that. No one will forget that. And there'll be loyalties based on that real world response to human need.
So the question from Helene again, Helene, do you want to ask the question, or do you want us to just answer it? Okay.
I'm wondering, just to answer it, I mean, the fear always is there's not enough to go around, especially when it comes to dollars. But do you think that innovations will bring new dollars, maybe from new places? How will the funding models change?
I'd like to, if I may, challenge the foundation of that assertion. There are legitimate funding issues that prohibit the individual congregation and the JCCs and the Federation from being as innovative as we might hope they could be. But I've never, and I've worked in several congregations, and I've worked with other congregations in an advisory capacity. There was as an example, a congregation of a couple of hundred members in Ohio, and they were, they could barely make their budget. And then it was in the township, which was losing its Jewish population. One of their biggest worries was the Jewish cemeteries, because they were afraid that as the Jewish population dwindled, these cemeteries would come into disuse. And they realized that if each congregation kicked in $100,000, between $100,000 and $250,000, depending on the size of the congregation, they could buy perpetual care for everything. So this congregation, which didn't have enough money for a full-time rabbi, comes up with $100,000. Where they got that $100,000, I don't exactly know. But all of a sudden, they had that $100,000. And I guess the point that I'm making is there's more funding available than people realize, but it's just like Congress of the United States, the leadership of the congregation funds what it wants to fund, and it has its own priorities. When the priorities in the congregations become more flexible and they recognize, then they will become more innovative. Now, it has been in the past, and here the dynamics work against each other. Watch how this happens. When you had more clergy-centric congregations, the member of the clergy, if it was the rabbi or the cantor or the educator, could initiate these types of programs, and depending on how popular they were or how persuasive they were or how adept they were, they could find the money within the congregation. But as the dynamics change and we become more or less clergy-centric, it becomes much harder for the clergy to do this. Then it has to come from the lay leadership. So my answer to that would be, I think there's a lot more money in the community, but at this point it is not prioritized, and it will be. There's no way that it won't be eventually, because evolution is going to change. It's going to create change, and congregations that do not have this flexibility are going to have a very hard time continuing. Avi, would you?
No, I don't think that we should fund programs. I think that's a big mistake and has been what has sunk us for a while. Why? Because when you fund a program, it has a life of its own. I think we have to fund goals and results, meaning we have to fund our values. When a board, when leadership really comes together to discuss why are we in business? What's our why, as they talk about in the business world? What are we trying to do, and how can we do it? Let's create a budget this year for doing it this way. Let's follow the science, meaning do we collect data? Do we know if there is an impact? What is the impact? And then we could fund that initiative again. But once you just fund a program and that becomes the line item, it gets stultified. It just won't work in the future and doesn't keep us nimble, especially as, look, our idea is to fund teen socialization so that people meet each other and all. Okay, that's the goal. What programs can we create that do that? And let's keep revisiting those programs and make new ones and fund those that are effective. And I think that's the only way to keep leadership on its toes, and to let people know that whatever money they're donating is going to accomplish this, not just for a program with a name on it.
I think, Avi, what you're suggesting, if I may, is that just as organizations have a constitution, and usually the beginning of the constitution is a mission statement, and that if the congregation or if the organization is healthy, all of the decisions and discussions are funneled through that mission statement. Is what we are discussing, what would our mission statement tell us to do? And that what I think you're suggesting is that we should have mission statements for our priorities as well, so that what programs can we have that will help us accomplish this mission statement? And then once we have that, once we have that framework, then the answers are actually fairly clear, and we don't fund things that are not part of our mission.
Right.
But we have to understand why we're here. And maybe that's a good way of ending the conversation tonight, which is to say that one of the things that this pandemic has opened for us is the possibility of a conversation of why do we exist? And what is our purpose? What is our goal? Avi?
If we are phrasing our goals and saying, look, any Jewish organization in this specific situation, even like a synagogue, should have a portfolio for feeding the hungry and healing the sick, and all of those God partnership pieces that are part of making us divine. When we fund that, we are saying, well, who does that? Oh, okay. So here's how our school-age children will be a part of that mission. Here's how the adult, the sisterhood, the men's club, here's how we're going to be doing that. Here's how we're going to join with other neighbors to do that. That's the program. You fund the mission, but look at all the other groups within the institution that will have funding to do its job and educate the constituents for going further.
And we'll find, to take an example, that we may not need new prayer books. One of the big issues is a movement comes out with a new prayer book every 5 to 10 years. And all of a sudden, are we going to spend $50,000 to $75,000 on a siddur? Well, if you have a mission statement of what your goals and priorities are, the question then becomes, do we really need a new prayer book? Because that ties into the denominational viewpoint, which is fine, but it's limited. So if there are no more questions, I would like to repeat and then pass it to Avi for his Parthian shots, so to speak. I'd like to repeat that this is a very exciting time because we're in transition. It's a very exciting time in legally and from our tradition, the great potential that is before us to show our flexibility and to change in ways that in truth, we'd never even envisioned before, or we didn't know how to put into practice. This is a very scary period of time in the near future, but we'll rise from this and we'll come out of it stronger. We'll come out of it changed. But that's been the nature of our tradition. That's the whole concept of the chain of tradition. We are one link in that chain. We are not responsible for completing the task, but we are required to be part of the endeavor. Avi?
Helene has another question about why Chabad is growing rapidly right now. So let's go back to Hillel. The original Hillel story, before he grew up into Rabbi Hillel, was of his origin story was of a very poor young man who couldn't even afford the tuition for his Hebrew school. And the story goes that at one point he tried to get in, he didn't have his half penny, and they refused. There was a guard at the gate and they refused him entry. He just wanted to study. So he climbed up on the roof. It was a winter day, and at one point it started snowing, and he fell asleep freezing, and they looked up and saw on the skylight a shadowy form. They ran up and found frozen Hillel up there. They brought him down into the house of study, and they warmed up water and brought him back to life. And the sort of enigmatic saying was, this is surely a person for whom it is okay to desecrate the Shabbat in warming up the water and bringing him back to life. It's a famous story that's not always plumbed for the depth of what it's really saying. Accessibility. We have to let, and that's why it's related to the Chabad success, it has to be related to opening your doors and being open to all groups and letting people come in and answering them on their level and taking them in with love. That's what the signature of the Jewish community and its institutions have to be. That is only a Hillel who came from that story, when he is older, has the chutzpah to say, I know I should study more with this person, but we're going to bring him in on one foot. He lived it as a kid, and it scarred him. That's why Chabad is doing so well, and around the world, not just here. So yeah, we could take some pages from their playbook, and also have this loose confederation, as all the Chabad houses do, of how to stake out smaller, more intimate places.
And Avi, correct me if I'm wrong, if the rest of that story with Hillel is they give Hillel permission to come into the academy, the yeshiva, every single day without paying, but everyone else has to pay.
Yeah, but
So it's a commentary on the Jewish community as
That's
well, because they were not inclusive.
right,
That's what Chabad is. Chabad is inclusive.
right.
JSurge would like, on behalf of JSurge, I'd like to thank Avi for being with us, and understand that this has been recorded and it will be on our website. So if you'd like to recommend for anyone to listen to what we had to say, all they have to do is go to our website, which is jsurge.org. And we wish everyone, Avi, if you have
Yeah, when you say that, so here's my covenantal request from all of you. Go to the website, make sure you know how to download the recording when it's available, and then have maybe either a nice socially distanced coffee with a few people inside or outside using a laptop, or channel it into your own Zoom, pay it forward, and use the discussion or pieces of it to create a question, and a debate with another circle of friends. Widen the discussion and see what comes out.
Hi, I'm just going to go in and intervene as the webmaster of the site, and I'm going to tell people exactly how they can go and view this recording. It's going to be posted on our YouTube page. So go to jsurge.org, and up at the top, you'll see a YouTube icon, and that will go ahead and direct you to exactly where you need to go.
And that is Joe Strassler, who is our wizard in residence. And we thank Joe as well. Without him, we would not be able to do any of this. So thank you and good night.